And joining us is Jonathan Odell. He's the author of The View from Delphi, a well-told story about a pair of families whose lives are altered by the bigotry of small-town Mississippi during the 1950s. Welcome. I'm glad to have you here.
It's good to be here, Gene.
This great stuff, and it's getting terrific reviews all over the place.
I'm mighty proud. And
kind of a surprise, right?
Very much of a surprise. I didn't start out to be an author. It was a last resort choice after I had been in business for many years and been a consultant, an executive consultant, and got to the place where things just didn't matter anymore. And what came up about the same time was this intense curiosity about my past life. I had moved from Mississippi to Minnesota, where I had been for many years, and I was watching a show on public television, and it was years after I had moved up. And it was old film clips of the Martin Luther King days. He was marching through Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Oh, really?
And there was a crowd of white people on the side of the road, of course, cheering at him and throwing things, waving their Confederate flags. And for the first time it hit me, it was like, oh my gosh, this is not black history, this is my history.
Right.
And into this void that I was feeling about my own life came this immense curiosity about, you know, what was my life really like? I grew up in 1951, Mississippi. I was born in segregated Laurel, Mississippi. And people in the North talk about the South being segregated. And we did have de jure segregation, where I went to white schools, I went to white movie theaters, the blacks sat above us in the balconies. But our towns were so small, there were only 5,000, 10,000 people, with half black and half white. And really, you couldn't segregate people physically.
No.
We saw each other day by day. They were in our homes. Blacks were shopped in white stores. We passed each other on the street. So what I realized later in life, that it wasn't the physical segregation that had, I think, damaged my history or anesthetized my history. It was a psychological segregation. To keep something like Jim Crow, just a brutal regime of government in effect, you had to train your children not to see black people, not to see them as individuals. We saw them as functionaries. I saw them as maids. I saw them as sharecroppers, as field workers, as gardeners. But we had this prohibition against eye contact. And later on I realized that wasn't so much a sign of respect or superiority. It was to keep from seeing black people as individual human beings. If you saw them that way, then you probably could not impose something like Jim Crow on top of them. So all of this came upon me, and I said, you know, I don't even know my own history. And I became really hungry. So for the next 10 years, I studied black history in Mississippi. I wanted to know what happened on the other side of the color line that I was protected from. And I there was a New York Times story, and it was Is a Dream Dead? And it was like 20 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And in it, this reporter had gone across the country and interviewed different people, common people, about, is Martin Luther King's dream still alive or is it dead? And they interviewed a woman from Marks, Mississippi. Actually, she's from Falcon, Mississippi, which is outside Marks, Mississippi, and her name was Fannie Smith, and she was the mayor, an African-American woman, mayor of Falcon. And Falcon, if you don't know, had 300 people in it, 299 black people, one white person, and the white person lived on the other side of the tracks to this day. So I called her up and I said, Miss Smith, I said, we're the same age, and we grew up in the same state together, but I don't know a thing about your people or how you grew up. I said, do you have stories you can tell me? And she said, I would love to tell you my stories. So I got on a plane, I flew to Mississippi, to Memphis, rented a car, looked her up, and she took me around and told me these stories that I had no idea existed in our state. They were field workers, they were civil rights workers, they were maids, they were midwives who traveled on mules in the 1920s to deliver babies. There were these acts of heroism that aren't written down. And there was a sharecropper who explained why. He said, honey, to me, he said, when God handed out the possessions, he gave the black man the hoe and the white man the pencil. And then it hit me, I've got to write a book.
Yeah.
I've got to catch these stories before they're gone. And the black stories and white stories I had read about in Mississippi, if it's written by a white person, black people are like this backdrop. You pull a black person out if you want to create a feeling of anger or insanity or pity, but they're like symbolic. Or if a black person writes a story about Mississippi, the white people end up being just as stereotypical. So I wanted to know what would happen if you populated a page of a book with both blacks and whites, but you delve deeply into their complexities, so that you have full-blown human beings having relationships in ways that that are hidden from us. Those ways that we connected on the streets in the South in the 1950s, understanding our codes, understanding there are certain things we couldn't and could do, but still we had a complex life together anyway.
But not looking into souls.
Right, exactly.
Which is what people didn't do.
Keeping those convenience.
And you're doing this and having your first writing experience at the same time. Well, you've been a writer, but not a novel.
Right. Yes, I was. I'd written some business things. I'd written some leadership materials for the executives I worked with, but I had never written fiction. I was too afraid to write fiction.
Your dad was still back here in Mississippi.
That's right.
At the time.
Exactly. My parents were still in Laurel, Mississippi. They're my biggest fans.
Yeah.
So I was writing it a lot out of therapy to start out with. My family was really well represented in the book, our histories, which I was afraid of.
How did they feel about that?
You know, the first draft was a lot different than the final book. The first draft was mean-spirited. I think a lot of people write their first book to explain all the injustices they've experienced
to explain
in life.
themselves.
Exactly.
To get everything out.
And it was vicious. It was angry. It was like, here's how I was brought up, and here's how I felt like I was ripped off. A lot of experiences were mean-spirited toward my family. When I finished the book, it's like I said, you know, I do not want, if this ever does get published, I don't want my parents buying it on the stand and reading this. I need to show them what I've written, and then we need to talk about this. My parents are very courageous people. They read the book. My dad read the book first, and he came into my bedroom. He says, "You can't let your mama read this."
Too tough.
I said, "Why not, Daddy?" He said, "You just can't. It'll hurt her."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, she's got to." And so and she read it, and at the end of the book, a lot of the book at the first draft was about a little kid and how he was treated by his parents. And she was crying at the end of the book. And I said, "Mama," I said, "what's the matter?" And she said, "I love this book." She said, "Only one thing I wish." And I said, "What, Mama?" She says, "I wish that I could have been that little boy's mama. I would have taken better care of him." So it was like, what it taught me is we see the world in our own individual ways. My family, there are 5 of us. We had 5 different lives in that family. Our stories were totally different.
You and your father were kind of going down a similar parallel path, health path at the same time, weren't you?
Right. I had sent the book out, and the agent had not sold it. At the time, the agent had dropped me. So I was pretty depressed. I'd gone back to doing some consulting work. I got a call from Mississippi saying that my dad was diagnosed with cancer in both lungs, which, as you know, that's, say goodbye, that's fatal. A week later, I was supposed to be doing a really big presentation in front of some executives, and the strangest thing happened. I lost, a vocal cord went paralyzed, my left arm was paralyzed, my left side of my tongue was paralyzed, and my throat. Thought I had a stroke. They could not diagnose a stroke, heart attack. They could find nothing. So here I was, barely able to speak, and communication is my living. Up to this point, speaking was my living. And my dad supposedly was dying of cancer. So I said, what the heck? So I just sent the book out. I felt like I had nothing left to lose. My ego was dead. So I sent the book out to the people I originally wanted to send it out to start with, but my agent talked me out of it because they're a smaller literary press. They really love and treat Southern literature with respect, but they're smaller. So I sent them out to McAdam Cage. I went to Mississippi to be with my dad. We flew him back and forth to the MD Anderson Medical Clinic, cancer clinic. They said 3 months, maybe a year, maybe longer, but it's both lungs. Don't get your hopes up. So we'd flown back on the company's jet. We're standing in my dad's kitchen. He was sitting at the kitchen table. I was looking at him. I can't talk. He doesn't know what to say. The phone rings. It's the editor from McAdam Cage. He says, "We just read your book, and we love it. We want to publish it." And Gene, I don't even know what emotion to have.
Yeah.
I don't know whether to cry. I don't know whether to jump up and down. The part that was so fulfilling was I really wanted to dedicate the book to my dad. Because in writing the book, I started out with having two parents. I understood them as parents, I thought, but being a parent is such a small part of a person's life. By the end of the book, I understood them as majestic characters. They're amazing characters to have lived through what they lived through, and they wanted to spare us all the things they had to go through.
Yeah.
And they shared their stories openly and with vulnerability, and it gave the book richness. And something about also losing both of my parents. My mother also got critically ill during the writing of this book, that I was able to put so much compassion and understanding in the book because of their contributions. What I learned about racism, I moved to Minnesota ashamed of the South. I wanted to turn my back on racism and about how bad we were and how violent we were. And through writing the book, I realized I can't leave the South. Thomas Wolfe said you could never go home again,
No.
but you can never leave it either. And I'm part of the South, and I'm just as racist as anyone. And what I learned was racism is a gift from those people who love us, not the villains in our world. It's from our preachers, our teachers, our parents, and they give us this racism in a way they tell us, you know, you may not have nothing, you may not have much, but honey, you're not black. And that may sound like a vicious thing, but it's given by people that you love. So how can you turn your back on that? So the way to deal with racism is not turn your back on it, but it's to go back to those people and realize they're complex human beings. And don't shut down the garden, but pull the weeds. So it makes me human, and it makes them human. And the thing about Mississippi folks is we're good people trying to do the best. And we got some faults. And those faults make us really good characters.
Right.
They're really interesting.
Really
That's why there's so much
interesting characters to
literature
write
comes
about.
from the South.
And that's why Minnesotans are so fascinated with Mississippi.
It's so interesting doing a Mississippi reading and doing a Minnesota reading. The questions are totally different. Minnesotans are fascinated by race, especially Southern racism. Minnesotans, Northerners take a lot of comfort in Southern racism. What Minnesotans and Northerners don't realize is that Southerners take a lot of comfort in Northern racism too. It's two different things. Northerners will study about racism, they will read about it, but they are very unwilling to walk into a relationship that's different for them. In other words, they don't broach black people.
Right.
Black people they treat as exotic, as they become very politically correct, and blacks know this. To them, that's racist too. Southerners, we have this arrogance about racism. We think we know about our black people because we grew up with them. We think we know because we see that presentation they give us, that we think that we understand black people. So we're not curious about racism. The good thing about us is we will blunder into relationships with black people. Mm-hmm. That arrogance of familiarity at least gets us to talking. And that's why I think the South holds the future for the cure for racism, because at least we talk. At least we have a language around race.
I discovered when I lived up there that much of that same racism exists among people in the North for American Indians, Eskimos.
And they compartmentalize it. They don't see it as the same. They can look at me and they can say, "You're from Mississippi. How could you treat blacks that way?"
Right.
And yet, segregated in the same town is the Indians' neighborhood. Those people are mistreated,
or the Vietnamese neighborhood, or the Chinese neighborhood.
But it's compartmentalized.
Well, it's a fascinating read. Congratulations to you.
Thank you, Gene.
And your good work, Jonathan Odell. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
And we'll be right back.